She was 51 years old, newly widowed, and standing in the dust of a Kansas auction yard with $68.30 sewn into the hem of her coat, every remaining cent of a life that had taken 30 years to build and 11 months to dismantle. The man who had dismantled it was not a stranger. He was her late husband's brother, Harlan Deeds, who had produced a document on the morning of the funeral, notarized and cold as a January creek, that transferred the deed of the Deeds family farm, every acre, every tool, every fence post, to himself, and who had given her until the first frost to vacate the house where she had raised 3 children and buried one. She left with her sewing kit, her mother's Bible, a change of clothes, and that $68. At the Culloden County Public Auction on a gray October morning in 1891, while men in canvas coats laughed and traded tobacco jokes, she bought the only thing she could afford that no one else wanted, a welded-shut iron toolbox, black with old grease and sealed at every seam, that had been dragged from a collapsed barn on the edge of town. The auctioneer's assistant had to read the lot number twice because the first bid, $3, came from a boy who immediately withdrew it when his father shook his head. She paid $65. The crowd genuinely laughed. What none of them knew, what she herself did not yet suspect, was that inside that sealed iron box was something that had been waiting, patiently, silently, for nearly 2 decades, to undo an injustice far larger than her own, and to give an entire town back something it had been quietly grieving without ever knowing the name of what it had lost. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Marguerite Voss. If you've ever stood in a place that felt forgotten, or held something the world told you was worthless, we'd be grateful if you'd tell us about it in the comments below. The ledger always balances, her mother used to say, though it does not always balance quickly. And the things people lock away in the dark are always more interesting than the things they put in the window. Marguerite Voss had learned both of these things the way she had learned everything worth knowing, not from instruction alone, but from the particular education of a woman who has had to be the only one in the room paying attention, and who has found, more than once, that this is exactly the position from which the most important things become visible. Settle in. We have told you the story of Marguerite Voss. Dora Flum came to the farm the following spring and they sat on the porch together with coffee and neither of them said very much, because there are kinds of understanding that do not require a great deal of language. Dora brought a cutting from her rose bush, which Marguerite planted along the fence line near Peter's cottonwood, and it came back every summer for years after that, red as a legal stamp, wild as old evidence, rooted as anything that was ever meant to stay. The crossing was renamed, by that time, to Voss Field, though Marguerite had nothing to do with the renaming and was, in fact, somewhat embarrassed by it. It was the county commission's doing, a small gesture after the resolution of the Aldred case, a way of marking the place and the moment. She thought her mother might have found it amusing. She thought Werner Haas would have said nothing at all, only looked at her hands. She was 51 years old when she stood in that auction yard and the crowd laughed, and she was 67 when she sat on that porch with Dora Flum and the roses, and the distance between those 2 moments, which looked from the outside like a restoration and from the inside like a long piece of work done with the right tools, was the shape of Marguerite Voss's life as she came to understand it, not as something that had happened to her, but as something she had, through patience and precision and the refusal to discard what others wrote off, built. There is an image that Marguerite returned to in the years that followed, not often, but at certain quiet moments, early mornings in the kitchen, or late evenings on the porch when the light went long and amber across the east field. It was the image of herself at 51, standing in a packed dirt auction yard in a coat with $68 sewn into the hem, raising her hand for a welded-shut iron box that a crowd of men found funny. She would think about that image, and she would find in it something that was not bitterness and was not quite satisfaction but was closer, perhaps, to the feeling you have when a ledger balances, when the numbers on both sides of the page, after long and patient work, come finally into agreement. She had not opened that box looking for justice. She had opened it the way her mother had opened every new ledger, with the simple belief that what was inside deserved to be named. The justice had been inside all along. It had been waiting for someone with the right hands and the patience to listen to iron. The boarding house on Alder Street was eventually sold to a family from Missouri who turned it into a proper inn and painted the shutters green. The toolbox itself Marguerite kept. She set it on the workbench in the tool shed behind the house, the shed that had been Werner Hasse's and that she had essentially annexed at 13 and never given back, and it sat there with its lid open. She never closed it again, and held her own tools, the cold chisel and the flathead bar and the small hammer that had opened it, arranged inside it with the practical order of a woman who knows exactly where everything is and exactly what it is worth. Harlan did not fight. Men like Harlan, Marguerite had observed across 51 years, are brave when they believe their position is unassailable and become very small very quickly when it is not. He vacated the deed's property in February. The deed was restored to Marguerite's name in March, after an additional 2 months of filings and corrections that Theodore Crane handled with considerable skill and a reasonable fee that Marguerite paid in 3 installments from the first season's rental income on the East Field, which she leased to a neighboring farmer while she decided what to do next. Gerald Aldred was removed from his office by the county commission in April and was subsequently indicted on 7 counts of official fraud. He was convicted of 3, which was not everything, but was, as Theodore Crane observed, enough. Of the 41 families documented in Hessler's ledgers, 22 were located, 14 of those were awarded formal remediation through the commission's process, restored titles, reversed forfeitures, tax refunds with interest, and the remaining 8 received at minimum the official documentation of what had been done to them, which is not nothing, and which Marguerite understood to matter in a way that was not about money. A wrong named is not the same as a wrong undone, but it is the necessary beginning of it. She had learned that from her mother, who had learned it from keeping books in a foreign country where she knew no one, who had understood that the first act of dignity is to write it down. Marguerite spent those weeks doing what she did, keeping records. She contacted, by letter, 9 families she had identified from the ledger books as still living in the county, explaining what she had found and asking them to come forward with whatever records they had kept of their original filings, their tax payments, their claims. 6 responded. 3 had kept records. 2 of those had kept records that directly contradicted the county's official files in ways that were now, with Hessler's cross-reference, explicable. One woman, a 73-year-old named Dora Flum who still lived on a reduced parcel east of the crossing, had kept every tax receipt from 1868 to 1895 in a cigar box under her porch, and she arrived at Theodore Crane's office one morning in December with the cigar box under her arm and the expression of someone who has been waiting a very long time for someone to ask. The authentication motion was denied. The commission proceeded. Harlan Deeds received a letter from the circuit court in January, informing him that the deed transfer of the Deeds family property was under review in connection with a broader investigation into county recording irregularities. The letter was signed by Judge Hargreaves. It was accompanied by a secondary notice from Theodore Crane, who had, at Marguerite's eventual telling of her own situation, identified a specific entry in Hessler's ledger that referenced a boundary alteration on the original Deeds family farm filing in 1871, an alteration that had, decades later, been used as a technical pretext in the preparation of Harlan's fraudulent deed transfer, because the boundary irregularity created a legal ambiguity in the title chain that a dishonest notary could exploit. Gerald Aldred had not merely been Harlan's notary. He had been his enabler, providing the specific legal leverage that made the transfer appear valid. And that ledger entry named him. Gerald Aldred, when served with the petition on Wednesday, retained 2 lawyers from Topeka and issued a public statement calling the evidence fabricated. The 2 Topeka lawyers, upon reviewing the actual documents, quietly resigned from the case 3 days later. Gerald Aldred's public statement was not formally withdrawn but was not repeated. The county judge, a methodical man named Hargreaves who had been on the bench for 17 years and who had, in that time, developed an almost physical aversion to fraud, impaneled a special review commission the following week. This was where opposition came from another direction. 4 of the county's established landowners, men who had benefited, perhaps without full knowledge, from the artificially low auction prices at which Aldred-adjacent land had sold in the early 1870s, retained their own lawyer and filed a competing motion arguing that the evidence, having been sealed and abandoned for 17 years, could not be authenticated and should not be admitted. Their lawyer was persuasive, and there was a period of 3 weeks in November during which it appeared genuinely possible that the court might decline to act. She told him what she had. She told him where she had found it. She did not yet tell him about her own situation, because that was not why she was there, not yet. She was there because 41 families had been wronged and the evidence was in her boarding house room wrapped in 17-year-old oilcloth, and because whatever else Marguerite Voss was, she was her mother's daughter, and Greta Scholl had taught her that a record kept in secret is only half a record, the other half is the presenting of it. Theodore Crane closed the ledger. He opened it again. He read 4 pages. He closed it again. He looked at Marguerite with the expression of a man recalculating several things simultaneously, and then he said, very carefully, Mrs. Voss. Where exactly did you say you found this? What happened next was not immediate, because the law, like iron, does not yield to a single tap but requires patient and repeated application of the right tools. Theodore Crane filed a petition with the Circuit Court the following Monday, citing newly discovered evidence of systematic fraud in county property records. The petition, which named Gerald Aldred directly and cited the cross-referenced ledger as its primary evidence, was accompanied by a request for an emergency injunction on any county property transactions pending review. Clarence Aldred, Marguerite read slowly, pressing each page flat against the floor to keep her hands from trembling with recognition of what she was holding. Clarence Aldred's son was Gerald Aldred, who was now the county recorder. And Gerald Aldred was the notary public in whose office the county land records were maintained. And the county recorder's office was where any legal challenge to a property transfer would first be filed. And it was Gerald Aldred, whose name she had seen on documents, whose office she had briefly considered approaching before deciding she could not afford a legal fight, whose name was on the notary's stamp on the deed transfer that had taken her farm. She sat with that connection for a very long time. The lamp burned low. The wind moved on. By morning, she had read every page of every ledger. By mid-morning, she had organized the documents in the order that would be most legible to a judge, the way her mother would have organized them, the way every bookkeeper knows to organize evidence, chronologically within category, with the cross-referencing index placed first so that the reader understands the system before the system speaks. By noon, she was walking to the law office of Theodore Crane, who was the only attorney in Culloden County who had no professional relationship with the Aldred family, and who was known primarily for handling estate disputes and the occasional railway easement, and who looked up from his desk when Marguerite set the first ledger book in front of him with the particular expression of a man who expects to be bored and finds himself, instead, genuinely alarmed. No one caught them because August Hessler had been very good at his job, and the evidence of what he had done lived only in the original source documents, which he had not destroyed. He wrote that he could not bring himself to destroy them, that this was perhaps his only moral achievement of the period, but instead had copied, organized, and sealed in this box, along with a ledger of his own making that cross-referenced every alteration against the official record and named, in each case, the original rightful owner, the parcel in question, the date, and the amount Aldred had paid him to make the change. There were 41 entries. 41 families. Some of them, Hessler wrote in his letter, he believed were still in the county. Others had moved on, driven by the failures that his hand had engineered. He had planned to come forward. He had been preparing to go to the circuit court when Aldred had become aware of his intentions, he did not say how, and when Hessler had understood that Aldred was a man who preferred problems to disappear rather than be solved, he had done the only thing he could think of, he had sealed the evidence in the strongest box he owned, welded it shut in his barn, and fled the county that night with his family and nothing else, leaving behind the farm, the barn, and the terrible careful truth inside the iron box. August Hessler, as the letter explained in careful, unhurried prose that suggested a man who had something important to say and not enough time to say it badly, had been the land agent for Culloden County from 1861 to 1873, the man, that is, who had maintained the county's official property records during the critical years of post-war resettlement, when hundreds of families were filing claims, purchasing parcels, and establishing homesteads across the county. He had been, by his own accounting, a competent agent and for most of his tenure an honest one, with one exception, and that exception had lasted for 3 years in the early 1870s and had involved a man named Clarence Aldred. Clarence Aldred, as Marguerite would gradually understand through the ledger book spread across her boarding house floor in the hours that followed, had been the principal merchant and informal financier of the crossing in those years, a man of considerable local influence who had hit upon a method of acquiring land that was simple and nearly invisible. He had paid Hessler to alter the county property records. Not to forge deeds, which would have been obvious, but to make smaller, subtler changes. A boundary line moved 40 feet, a parcel number transposed so that a homesteader's claim appeared to belong to a different filing, a tax payment recorded as delinquent when it had been paid in full, triggering a forfeiture that sent the land to auction where Aldred's associate purchased it for cents on the dollar. The alterations were small enough, and the county's filing system chaotic enough in those years, that no one caught them. There were no tools inside. There were no coins, no jewelry, no weapons, none of the things that people who seal iron boxes usually put inside them. What was inside the toolbox of the Hessler barn was paper. Neat, bound, organized paper, ledger books, 6 of them, brown-covered and tied in pairs with waxed cord, along with a wrapped bundle of individual documents sealed in oilcloth, and beneath all of it, wrapped in a piece of burlap that had aged to a fine silver gray, a single folded letter, unsealed, addressed in a formal copperplate hand to no one and everyone, to whoever opens this. I have run out of time but not of conscience. August Hessler, March 14, 1874. Marguerite sat on the floor of her narrow room with the letter in her hands for a long time before she read it, because she understood, with the intuition of a woman who had spent her life in the company of ledgers and the stories they quietly told, that she was about to enter someone else's reckoning, and she wanted to do it with the proper gravity. She waited until the house was quiet, until the last door down the hall had closed and the last light under the gap had gone dark, and then she opened the canvas roll she had carried out of the deeds house along with her sewing kit, the roll of metalworking tools that were, technically, Harlan's property now, since they had lived in her kitchen drawer for 20 years, and about which she felt precisely no guilt. Marguerite thought about $65. She thought about Werner Haas and what he had taught her about sealed iron and about the things people seal inside it. She thought about what her mother had said once, on a slow afternoon in the mercantile, that the things people put away and lock up are always more interesting than the things they put in the window. She raised her hand. $65, she said, clearly, and several people turned to look at her as if she had said something in a foreign language. The laughter was not cruel, exactly. It was the laughter of people who assumed they understood the situation better than she did. The auctioneer, to his credit, looked merely puzzled. He confirmed the bid, looked around for a higher offer, found none, and dropped his gavel with the particular finality of a man dispensing of something he will not think about again. Marguerite paid, arranged for the boy with the ledger to help her load the box onto a borrowed handcart, and wheeled it the 6 blocks to the boarding house on Alder Street where she had taken the cheapest room available, a space that was barely wider than its single bed and that smelled of pine tar soap and other people's history. She positioned the box against the wall, sat down on the edge of the bed, and looked at it in the amber light of the oil lamp, and she felt something she had not felt in 11 months. She felt curious. It was iron. She could tell that from 10 feet away by the weight of its shadow, by the way it sat on the ground with the absolute stillness of something that had not been moved in a long time. It measured, she estimated, approximately 18 inches long and 12 inches deep, with a handle welded across the top in the style of industrial storage cases she had seen in Werner Haas's shop, the kind designed to be carried by a single person but to hold a great deal. The lid was welded shut. Not padlocked, not latched, not merely stuck, welded, with 3 solid runs of what appeared to be iron flux seal across all 4 seams. Someone had sealed this box with considerable effort and with the apparent intention that it not be opened again. The auctioneer's assistant, a boy of about 16 with a ledger and a pencil, told her the provenance when she asked. It had come from the collapsed Hessler barn on the south edge of town, which had been abandoned since at least 1874, possibly longer. The Hessler family, did she know them? She did not, had left the county years ago, no forwarding address, no living relatives anyone could locate. The box had been inside the barn under a workbench, covered by what was once a saddle blanket but was now a suggestion of fiber. It weighed, he consulted his sheet, between 60 and 70 pounds. The county wanted it gone. The opening bid was $3, placed and immediately withdrawn by the boy with the embarrassed father. A man in a sheepskin vest offered $4.50. Another man shook his head at $5. At $6, there was silence, and the auctioneer looked out over the small and mostly uninterested crowd with the expression of a man who had learned not to be surprised by what people didn't want. The Culloden County auction was held on the second Saturday of October, as it was every year, on a packed dirt lot behind the feed cooperative on Grain Street, and it drew, as it always did, the dual population of people who were selling things they needed to be rid of and people who were hoping to acquire things for less than they were worth. Marguerite arrived early, not because she expected to find anything useful, but because she had nowhere else to be and because she had, all her life, found clarity in the act of inventory, in the looking at and the naming of things. She walked the rows of lots in the gray morning light, cataloging with the professional detachment her mother had taught her, a set of pressed-in ceiling panels from the old hotel, water-stained and bent at the corners, 3 barrels of fence wire, probably salvageable, a church organ with 2 broken stops that would need a craftsman, and at the end of the last row, half buried under a folded canvas tarp, the toolbox. She could have fought. Several people told her she should fight. The circuit judge was a reasonable man, they said. She had records. She had witnesses. She had the moral weight of nearly 3 decades. What she did not have was money for a lawyer, or time, or the certainty that a reasonable judge would read a woman's bookkeeping records as evidence of ownership in a Kansas court in 1890. She also knew something that no one else in the crossing knew, something she had carried for 5 years like a stone in her shoe, and this was the knowledge that the document Harlan had produced, whatever it said on the surface, was not consistent with what Eldon had told her the last time they had spoken clearly, 3 weeks before his death, when he had taken her hand and said, "The farm is yours, Maggie. I've seen to it." She had believed him. She had not asked for paper. And now she was paying for that faith with everything she owned. She packed what she could carry. She gave the children, grown now, scattered across the state, the barest account of what had happened, sparing them the bitterness she could not yet afford to feel. And on the 1st of October, with $68.30 hemmed into her coat and the particular straightness of spine that her mother had modeled for her across 51 years, she walked out of the house at dawn before Harlan arrived to change the locks, and she did not look back, because she had already memorized every inch of it, and looking back would not have served her. The document, as Marguerite read it in the cold parlor of the house she had lived in for 26 years, was a deed transfer, dated 5 years prior, signed by Eldon, witnessed by 2 men she did not recognize, and notarized by a notary public in Topeka whose stamp she had never seen before on anything that passed through the county. It transferred the full title of the deed's family property, 312 acres, the house, the barn, the granary, the toolshed, all of it, to Harlan Deeds, to take effect upon Eldon's death. Marguerite read it twice. She set it down. She asked Harlan's lawyer 3 questions, which the lawyer answered with the smooth intonation of a man who has answered prepared questions before, and which told her nothing she did not already know. The document was, on its face, legal. She had no copy. She had never seen it before. And while she had in her tin box beneath the kitchen floorboard 28 years of farm ledgers that documented her own contribution to every dollar of value on that property, a woman's name on a ledger was not the same as a woman's name on a deed, and both Harlan and his lawyer knew it. Eldon Deeds died in the November of 1890, not dramatically and not suddenly, but in the slow, withdrawing way that some men die, a bad winter, then a worse spring, then a summer cough that settled deep and did not leave. Marguerite sat beside him through 31 days of it and held his hand through the last 7, and when he was gone, she felt the particular grief that comes not from losing a person entirely but from losing the language you had developed together, the shorthand of 3 decades, the way a certain silence at breakfast meant one thing and a certain silence at supper meant another. She grieved, but she did not fall apart. Marguerite Voss, she had returned to her birth name in her own mind long before it became legally relevant, in the way that women of a certain interior strength sometimes quietly reclaim themselves. Marguerite was not the kind of woman who fell apart. She was the kind of woman who, in the midst of grief, inventoried. Harlan Deeds arrived 4 days after the funeral. He was Eldon's younger brother by 11 years, a man of moderate height and considerable self-regard who had spent his adult life in Topeka doing something in land brokerage that he described differently depending on who was asking, and who had always regarded Marguerite with the particular hostility of a man who resents a woman for being competent in domains he considers his own. He arrived in a good coat. He arrived with a lawyer. He arrived with the document. When she married Eldon Deeds at 22, she married a decent, quiet farmer who respected her intelligence in the particular way that some men of that generation did, with admiration tinged by a certain bafflement, as if he had found an instrument he did not entirely know how to play but was grateful to own. They built something solid together. Marguerite kept the books for the farm with the same precision her mother had brought to the general store, and she kept them in the double-entry method she had taught herself from a text she borrowed from the lending library in Salina. Every transaction entered twice, every balance verified, every receipt preserved in a tin box beneath the kitchen floorboard. Eldon knew the land and the weather. Marguerite knew where every dollar went and why. They had 3 children who lived and one who did not, a son named Peter who came early and too small in the spring of 1878 and who was buried under the cottonwood at the east edge of the property with a stone Marguerite lettered herself, pressing each character into wet mortar with a nail, because she could not afford an engraver and she was not willing to leave her child's name to chance. The other children grew. The farm grew. And for 28 years, the life that Marguerite and Eldon built together was not glamorous and was not without difficulty, but it was theirs, and it was real, and it was documented, every inch of it, in Marguerite's careful hand. Marguerite grew up in that store, not behind the counter but beside the desk, watching her mother's pen move across columns of numbers with the same unhurried authority that a river moves across flat country, without drama, without error, without stopping. By the time Marguerite was 8, she could identify a transposition error at a glance. By 11, she understood the relationship between a merchant's credit terms and his moral character. By 14, she had developed what her mother called the habit of the ledger, which was not merely an accounting skill but a philosophy. Everything of value could be named, and once named, protected. A debt was not just money owed, it was a record of what one person had trusted another person to carry. Marguerite was also, and this mattered in ways she would not fully appreciate until much later, a gifted metalworker's apprentice, though the word apprentice was never spoken aloud, because she learned at the knee not of a blacksmith or a machinist but of old Werner Haas, the German-born toolmaker who had settled at the edge of the crossing in the early 1860s and who repaired farm implements for the surrounding county. Werner had no sons. He had no students. He had Marguerite, who showed up at his forge one afternoon when she was 12 years old with a broken hinge from her mother's hope chest and the earnest intention of fixing it herself, and Werner, who was not a man given to sentiment or speeches, had looked at her hands and said in his accented English, "You have good hands. Sit down." She sat down, and she kept sitting down, 3 afternoons a week for 6 years, learning the language of iron and heat, of temper and tolerance, of how metal behaved under pressure and what it cost when it failed. To understand Marguerite, you must first understand the woman who made her, and that woman was Greta Scholl, née Brower, who came to Kansas from Württemberg in the winter of 1857 with a husband who died of fever before their wagon cleared the Missouri border, a 6-month-old daughter bundled against her chest, and a set of bookkeeping ledgers tucked beside the infant that she had borrowed from the mercantile where she had worked in Stuttgart and never returned, because she knew, with the particular certainty of a woman who has nothing, that numbers would keep her alive when sentiment could not. Greta settled in the small farming community of Harlan's Crossing, which in those days was not yet called that, but was known simply as the Crossing, a flat-earth town that smelled of wheat chaff and well water and wood smoke, situated along a spur of the Smoky Hill River in the part of Kansas that the railroads had not yet decided to love. She took work as a seamstress, then as a laundress, then, when the general store owner discovered she could balance a ledger faster and more accurately than any man he had employed, as his bookkeeper, a position she held for 19 years and in which she built a quiet reputation for absolute precision and zero tolerance for the creative arithmetic that was common practice among merchants of that era.